All right, everybody. There we go. Everything's working now. For those of you joining us, thank you for your patience. We had a little slight technical difficulties, but we fixed it and we're all ready to go now. So I'm very happy to host today's interview with my good friend Effie Fokas. And but before I read Effie's bio and we start the interview, this, of course, is in our series, Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity. And we invite you to, I have to kind of put my computer here on Do Not Disturb to make sure I don't get any of those anymore. But we invite you to go to our website to see previous webinars with wonderful scholars of Orthodox Christianity, and to our YouTube page. There you can see this webinar series as well as other content. And sorry to ask this, but if you like our content, please like it on YouTube, because of course the algorithms get affected and other people perhaps can know about what we do, and even subscribe to our YouTube channel, because this way the work of the Orthodox Christian Center gets disseminated a little bit more broadly. So we invite you to be a part of all that we do here at Fordham at the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy, or at our e-publication, Public Orthodoxy. We are very, very excited to, let me just announce too, the next webinar in the series. We're going to have Phoebe Armanios, and Phoebe Armanios, who is going to speak to us, let me just get the title here, on Coptic Christianity, and that's going to take place on December 15th at noon, Tuesday, December 15th at noon. So Effie, welcome. We're looking forward to talking to you about Greece and religious pluralism and human rights and religious freedom. So let me read your bio, and then we'll sort of we'll jump right into it. So you are a senior research fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, which in Greek is ELIAMEP. Is that right? It's a kind of a long acronym, but it's kind of a hard one to. So, and a research associate of the London School of Economics Hellenic Observatory, and you received your master's and your PhD at the London School of Economics, right? And your background is in political science. In the last 2 decades, your research and writing have been concerned on religion in general and orthodoxy in specific, and with the interplay of a number of different fields and themes, including politics, law, human rights, nationalism, and European identity. You were the principal investigator of the European Research Council funded project on the grassroots impact of the European Court of Human Rights, Religious Freedoms Case Law, and sort of the acronym of that is GRM, or Grassrootsmobilise, right? And I want to really emphasize to everybody who's really attending and who will watch this, that it is incredibly, incredibly hard to get a European Research Council funded project. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. So it's congratulations to you, and it speaks really to the quality of your work, the creativity of it, and also sort of the foresight in terms of seeing the kinds of things that really should be studied and really should be engaged with. And just to kind of let everybody know, I mean, we also had Christina Stockel on our program, who also won an ECR funded project. Incredibly difficult. Did I say ECR? ERC, sorry, ECR. I'm getting confused with the European Court of Human Rights. There's too many acronyms here for me to kind of keep straight. So also at ELIAMEP, you completed your research project entitled Pluralism and Religious Freedom in Majority Orthodox Contexts in Europe, with the acronym of PLUREL, right? So your publications include Islam in Europe, Diversity, Identity, and Influence, co-edited with Aziz Al-Azmeh, Religious America, Secular Europe, co-authored with the very well-known sociologists of religion, Peter Berger and Grace Davie. The European Court of Human Rights and Minority Religions, co-edited with James T. Richardson. And you also have, I mean, you didn't include here in your bio, but you have an enormous amount of articles and book chapters and other kinds of writings really focusing on all these particular kinds of issues, right? And you're part of our Orthodoxy and Human Rights Project, the loose-funded Orthodoxy and Human Rights Project. And, you know, that we'll be able to get to that in a little bit just to see, you know, what will be the focus of your research for that particular project. And so we'll get to that in just a minute too. But let's begin with the way that we always begin here on our webinar series. Is just what, you know, how did you arrive at this point? Like where was that moment, you know, in your own life? And it could have been when you were very young or later. I mean, just when was that moment in your life where you said, gee, I want to study this, right? And I want to study Orthodox Christianity, but I want to study Orthodox Christianity in relationship to these various themes and issues. I mean, when did the light bulb go off or the aha moment happen in your life?
First of all, Davie, thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I wish we could be in person having these kinds of conversations. And it's such an honor to be part of this series, thinking, you know, who has preceded me in the series and who will surely come after. So thanks very much.
It's our pleasure.
I'm flattered. So my story, I'd say a first kind of precursor to my eventual research path has to do with kind of occurred during my undergraduate degree at Furman University, a small liberal arts school in South Carolina. But I need to give a bit of context to why and how I ended up there. As you know, I'm the child of Greek immigrants to the US who arrived in the US with no English and very little education. And the no English part especially made them especially nervous about us kind of interacting with American society, which they didn't understand. So our social lives were kind of limited to school, work at the restaurant, and church, where we could interact with other Greeks. So the little education part of their background, though, made them very excited when I was turning out to be a promising student in high school. No surprise, because I had no social life, you know, just church, work, and school. And so they were very excited at the time and said, we'll support you anywhere you want to go in the world to college. You know, they thought it was really great. And so I was freshman, sophomore year, and junior year, I declared I'd like to go to North Carolina, not too far, Duke or Chapel Hill. That's where I'd like to apply. They said, well, of course you can't leave home. Are you kidding? You know, there's a college in Charleston, and your brother went to college in Charleston. So what's wrong with that? So it was a real kind of crisis in our family. It was the first kind of major conflict. And, you know, I don't want to paint them as kind of stereotypical, my big fat Greek wedding parents. And I'm very grateful to them for their support of my education overall. But it was
it happened to my sister as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I know it's a familiar story. Yeah. So, and I understand, you know, their fears at the time. It took my brother's intervention, actually. He had to kind of broker a compromise, which said, okay, she leaves home, but she stays within South Carolina boundaries. Furman was the opposite end of South Carolina, and, you know, a good small liberal arts school. So that's how I ended up there. But knowing pretty little about, I'd say, the university, and I didn't know at the time that it had been affiliated, actually had been established by the Southern Baptist Convention. Mm-hmm. So a very conservative school, heavily populated by evangelical Christians. And it's just, you know, a kind of context that I wasn't familiar with. So within my first week or so at Furman, I was crying in my dormitory because a cousin of mine had died, and someone, a fellow student from the dorm, saw me crying, and she asked if she could pray with me. And I said, "Do you say that?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So she held my hands and, you know, started praying with me or for me, and in relation to my cousin as well. And you know, it was a bit of a strange experience for me. But at the end, she asked me a few questions, a series of questions. One of which was, you know, do you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior? And I thought, well, I know the answer to this. You know, I grew up in a Christian household, in a you know, an Orthodox background. And so I said yes. And from the next day on campus, I was being approached by people who I'd never met before, saying, you know, congratulations, we heard you've been saved, you know, the great news. And this was just a culture shock for me. It's a complete, you know, I had no preparation for this. It's kind of accidental salvation. And so it was kind of hard to navigate in the beginning, and understand what the expectations that, you know, might come along with this. So, you know, and I remember in all of my 12 years of Catholic schooling, and, you know, 18 years by then of attending a Greek Orthodox church in Charleston, I have to admit I'd never kind of encountered this kind of passionate and vibrant religiosity as I had at Furman. So, and I remember a political philosophy course, my professor was describing America as religious and Europe as secular. At the time, it was just it was a kind of foreign concept to me. My experience in the States had been very secular, the context. And then what I knew of Europe was Greece, which seemed to me very religious because of the public presence of religion in every sphere of society there. So as you know, and as you mentioned in relation to this book that I ended up writing with Peter Berger and Grace Davie, Religious America, Secular Europe. So these are themes that built into my work later, but at the time it was, just not at all evident to me where I would end up. So that, like, I call this a kind of first precursor, but it wasn't really an aha moment in a sense. I continued then to study European politics. I'd chosen to study European politics for my master's degree. I just wanted to kind of a ticket to Europe. And I went to the London School of Economics to study. And it was really during the Easter break of my first year there. So during my master's degree, we were meant to think of our topics for our master's dissertations over Easter break. And I went to Kefalonia, where my parents were based in, to spend Easter with them. And on Holy Thursday, we went to church, and the priest read at the end of the service an encyclical that had been circulated by the Archbishop of Greece, Christopoulos, about the dangers to orthodoxy of the Schengen Agreement. Now, the Schengen Agreement is an EU policy that you're familiar with. It. Maybe some of the listeners are not.
Give us a little sense of what it is, yeah.
Whereby there would be open borders for signatories of the Schengen Agreement between, so people could move without between borders, over borders without needing a passport. Right. And somehow, the original plan for the Schengen Agreement entailed a kind of identity card that would hinge for some reason, would have a barcode hinging on the number 666. Yeah. And the Orthodox were going crazy about this. And it wasn't just the Orthodox, a lot of also evangelical Christians, but there were fewer in number in Europe. So I was fascinated by this, of all days of the year to choose such a holy day, in the Orthodox calendar, to have such a solemn day kind of clouded by politics, I found really interesting. And, especially kind of this, the context in which it was happening in this little village church where I knew that very few people had ever heard of the Schengen Agreement, So I asked the priest for the letter afterwards for the encyclical, and I analyzed it as the beginning of my master's dissertation. I ended up writing about anti-Europeanism within the Orthodox Church. So from that point on, I was hooked. And I'd say that was really my kind of rebirth from a political scientist into a political sociologist of religion,
You're using that Southern Baptist language, rebirth. So you were born again into well, we have the Southern Baptists too. Well, life happens in these strange ways where, this very typical Greek immigrant experience of making sure that daughters stay close to home when they go to college, way back in, a few decades ago. But, it led you down a certain path, and I think we're all the better for it. I mean, I want to add, I have a very similar story, not with myself, but I was involved in this project on Emory at their own Center for the Study of Religion and Law, and Elizabeth was also a part of this, Elizabeth Prodromou, our friend, who's also been on the webinar series. And the funder of this particular project was a guy named Al McDowell, or it could be McDonald, I forget, but I think it's McDonald actually. And now I'm thinking about the difference between McDonald's and McDowell. I'm thinking about that movie Coming to America, if anybody knows what I'm talking about. But anyway, I'm jumping around too much here. But anyway, Al McDonald said he used to be in the Carter administration, and he's a businessman. He's passed away now, God rest his soul. He was a good man. But I remember him telling me that he went to Greece. He found out I was Greek Orthodox. We were getting some snacks or something during a break. And he said, "You're Greek Orthodox." So I went to Greece, and I was there with some businessmen. And I still can't help cracking up at this story because he's there with these Greek businessmen, and Greek businessmen. And he said, we sat down and we had drinks, and I asked him, I said, "What's your personal relationship with Jesus Christ?" And I was bracing myself like, oh my God, what did these Greek businessmen? And he said to me that they answered to him. They said, we believe in Jesus. We believe in Jesus Christ. They didn't know what to say. They were so flustered. but I'm sure you handled it with much more grace than they did. So anyway, we're way off topic, but these are wonderful stories to share. Right, because we're kind of near happy hour. We're kind of near happy hour here in the United States. But anyway, so from that point, you went on to study because, you know, we have the fall of communism, and, you know, we had Christina Stockel and Elizabeth was on, and we've been really talking about these notions of religious pluralism, the Orthodox majority countries. And so you actually went and studied religious pluralism and religious freedom, really, and the limitations on religious freedom in the traditional, what we call the majoritarian, really, Orthodox countries. And that, I mean, that's an issue in the 90s, right? Right at that moment when you're actually emerging from your undergraduate, your master's, you finished your PhD in 2004, all those issues were percolating. So tell us a little bit about that first entryway into some of these issues in terms of your own research. And this is the PLUREL project that we talked about, right?
Indeed, yeah. So I can probably describe that as also another aha moment in my life. Because by then I was based at the London School of Economics, having finished my PhD, but then just teaching, hired in the government department to teach theories of nationalism. And I established with 6 other staff members something called the Forum on Religion. It was just a kind of an organization to invite scholars and students to present their work on to do with religion, because the last person who'd had a chair in religious studies at or a chair that and whose focus, her own focus was religion, was in 2004. That ended in 2004. Eileen Berger. Maybe a little bit before, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Eileen Berger was one of these founding members of the Forum on Religion, and a great support to me because I was directing it, and she was always eagerly volunteering to chair meetings and things for me. So I was very grateful. And she then hosted a conference. She leads something called Inform at LSE, and Inform studies religious sects and kind of sometimes fringe religious groups and the problems that they face with religious freedom and suppression of their rights. So I have to admit, I wasn't very interested in attending the conference, but I felt like I ought to do this as a favor for Eileen because she was always so kind to me. And I went and I listened, and I was really surprised by the great number, proportionately, of presentations that had to do with limitations to religious freedom in majority Orthodox countries. And I wondered, what's going on? Is this really an accurate picture of what's going on? Is there something particular about Orthodoxy that leads to limitations to religious freedoms? And I became just incredibly curious about it. And then I applied to the European Commission for a particular grant called Marie Curie Fellowship, which is aimed to help European researchers move from all about mobility, move from one European context to another, one country to another, to conduct research. So I was ready to leave London at the time and moved from London, got married and moved to London, from London to Athens. In any case, I was planning on that move. So this helped me do that with a job in hand. So I arrived in Athens with this plan to study comparatively limitations to religious freedom in majority Orthodox countries of Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and Russia. And just to get a sense of similarities and differences, what might be common denominators and what might be some kind of interesting differences across the cases, especially post-communist versus Greece that didn't have a communist experience. And as I kept digging, I realized there is indeed something quite different about the Orthodox case. And if you look at European Court of Human Rights violations of religious freedoms, they are strikingly weighing towards Orthodox countries. A small number of countries has been responsible for a great percentage, over 60% of the Article 9, basically the religious freedom case law. And Greece specifically has, I think currently the percentage is about 17%. So it's one country of 47 countries responsible for 17% of violations found by this court of religious freedom. So there's a lot of food for thought there. And
well, I mean, I think it's interesting in the sense that some people might just say also, I remember in the late 90s, there was a big thing about sort of the new Russian religious law and proselytism. And so there's this tension of, countries that ultimately where religion was, it really was suppressed. I mean, each to a different degree, but, and then So some might, I mean, some might even be sympathetic to these restrictions on religious freedom. I mean, given the histories of what happened in these Orthodox countries, except maybe we can focus on Greece, except Greece, because Greece really, the fact that it has 17%, I mean, Greece was not under communist rule. And in many ways, Greece has had at least, now close to 2 centuries of, one might call it religious freedom. So that's interesting to see how even within Greece, after a couple of centuries, it still is somewhat of an issue there. It's still somewhat of a discussion point too. So, but let's move on. Let's continue, because all the stuff that you're doing, I mean, so, and in many ways, there's a certain kind of organic flow to your research, right? So you kind of, you sort of had that kind of focus, and that led you to this ERC funded Grassrootsmobilise study, right? Which is a multi-year study, involved, lots of money, which a team of people that you had to coordinate. And I know that you did lots of traveling and a lot of research on that. So do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about that too, in terms of that, what that research was about, some of your findings,
Yeah. So first, it was kind of a natural move from what I'd been doing before, focusing on the Orthodox context specifically, because as I'd mentioned, I started digging into the European Court of Human Rights cases to do with Orthodoxy, because they really, they were the first several cases in which that court found violations of religious freedom were all against, I think the first 12 were against majority Orthodox countries. So it was a natural move. But on the other hand, also, I really wanted a change from being focused just on Orthodoxy. And this in part because I've always been frustrated by the feeling that a lot of our discussion takes place kind of in a bubble, Orthodox conferences, and we're all speaking amongst ourselves. And I felt like there's really little literature written by non-Orthodox that includes Orthodoxy in a very substantial way. I think David Martin and Jose Casanova are real exceptions in this regard. I've always really appreciated their work for this. And so I wanted to go kind of further afield and include cases that are not majority Orthodox, and also I should say probably what inspired this particular research project, because when I first thought I'd apply for this, I mean, it was a fantastic opportunity, 5 years of, like you say, great funding, and I feel so incredibly lucky to have had that opportunity. So I decided I was going to apply for this grant, and I thought I would build on my previous research. Initially, I thought I'd build on this previous research on Orthodoxy, and maybe compare majority Orthodox contexts with non-Orthodox places, but on the same topics. And I was working on that really hard. I set aside a month to work on this. I spent 2 weeks writing that kind of grant proposal based on kind of building on PLUREL. And someone sent me an article in the middle of the night one night that he'd written about the Laozi case. Are you familiar with this case?
It would be good to just maybe give a little, I know what you're talking about, but maybe good a couple of sentences on that.
I love this case. I'll never be bored of this case. It's a case of atheist parents in an Italian school who objected to their children being in a school where there is the public display of the crucifix on all school walls, and that's mandated by law. And the European Court of Human Rights initially heard the case and decided in these parents' favor, indicating that indeed there's no place for religion in this way in a public school system, and the cross needs to go, the crucifix needs to go. And I was in Greece at the time, and the reactions that not so many people heard about it initially, but the church kind of had an antenna out for this. And I'd gone to a conference where kind of a legal scholar, a constitutional law scholar, gave a presentation about this case. And there was a bishop in the room who said, we need to protect our religious symbols from Europe. This was his reaction. We need to call them national symbols, and that way we can get away with having religious symbols kind of in schools. That's what he was thinking. And I found that fascinating. And so when my friend sent me his article about Laozi in the middle of the night, I wrote to him and I said, I wish I could read this now, but I'm busy writing this, this application, which is a pain for me at the moment. And as I thought about it more and more, I just said, I'm going to change topics completely. I'm going to write about the European Court of Human Rights and what people know about it. And, what kind of information gets to the public about the European Court of Human Rights, and do they use that information to gain their own rights? What kind of backlash against it develops, like amongst Greek Orthodox bishops?
Mm-hmm.
So Laozi was what inspired that particular project.
And what have you just, I mean, what have you discovered from it? I mean, what are maybe some of the key takeaways in terms of the project itself? Yeah.
First, that the court is a tremendously underused resource.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes decisions that apply. Once a decision is taken on a particular topic, any person living in any one of the 47 countries under this court's remit can have access to that same right. They could reach, they go through their national court levels and get to the European Court of Human Rights and claim that right. And that's over 800 million people who share the same rights once they've been established by the European Court of Human Rights. They have, they have the potential at least to win that right for themselves. With some variations, the court, I can't say, is always fair across the board, and it's it's a court under an incredible amount of pressure. So that's something that I worked on quite a bit. I had, like you mentioned, a team of scholars based in 4 different countries, postdoctoral scholars. They did a fantastic job doing the research in those countries, but there's no but to that, actually. They worked on the grassroots level, and I worked separately on something called the grass tops level, and looking at all the mobilizations around the court of law firms internationally, of governments, national governments. And I found that really intriguing and also very disturbing, because there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes work going on. There's really, really powerful organizations that try to sway the court in different ways, and the court tries to be independent of all these political pressures, but at the same time, its legitimacy depends on countries implementing its decisions.
Right.
And so if countries start getting so angry that they don't implement its decisions, then it's in a problematic situation. The UK was kind of a leading force trying to limit the court's ability to infringe on national sovereignty.
But I wanted to ask about the court's ability and its influence in a way. I mean, does it have influence? I mean, are its decisions taken seriously, or do they?
Oh, well,
do they somehow impact, and do they somehow impact? Does it depend on which majoritarian Orthodox country, perhaps, or yeah?
It varies tremendously from country to country. So Russia, for example, is notoriously bad at implementing decisions. Turkey is very bad at implementing decisions. And I did a lot of interviews with judges and former judges of the European Court of Human Rights, and they were quite open, saying, okay, it matters when a country like the UK stops implementing our decisions. It doesn't matter the same way when other countries who already have a very poor track record don't implement our decisions. So yes, it had. I mean, if I think of the state of religious freedoms in the Greek context, it has changed radically because of decisions taken by the European Court of Human Rights. There are very few issues that haven't been touched upon by that court.
Well, can you give us a sense of some of the issues? We're going to narrow it down in just a bit to one very live and very specific issue on religious education. But before we get to that specific issue, I mean, can you give us? I mean, one of the more well-known ones, of course, is building of a mosque, which is very controversial in Greece. And people won't be surprised if I say this. I mean, there is a certain kind of tension, I would say, within the Orthodox community in the United States when they highlight issues of Christian persecution, and they rightfully do so. There's no question about that. But at the same time, I know your work and I've read it, and but some of the things that come out in your work is that the Orthodox aren't great on religious freedom. They're really not. They're not at all. And something as maybe as simple as building a mosque within Athens, of all places, has taken like a decade or even longer to somehow really move through. So, I mean, that's one issue. I mean, but you can maybe give us just a small sample of some of the other issues too.
No, but I should point out before I go into depth with this, that that's not an issue that actually reached the European Court of Human Rights from the case, but there were many other issues close to that about establishing places of worship. So not specifically not related to this mosque building in Athens. But one of the most famous cases to do with religious freedom that the European Court of Human Rights dealt with comes from Greece. And it was the very first case that which the court found a violation of religious freedom. So the court had been operating for 33 years and had never taken a decision where it found religious freedom having been violated. It was a topic that the court was kind of really nervous to handle because it knew that it could have a potential backlash. Religion is a very sensitive issue for many countries. But in 1993, a case reached the court where I think they had very little choice but to reprimand the Greek state for its behavior. And this was the case of Kokkinakis versus Greece, in which a man named Manos Kokkinakis, a Greek living in Crete who had been a convert to Jehovah's Witnesses, he'd been arrested something like 60 times for sharing his belief for proselytism. And that's banned in the Greek context. It's illegal based on the Greek constitution, and it is defined, proselytism is defined in depth in a 1938 bit of legislation that came from during a Greek military dictatorship. So a Greek dictatorship. So it's an incredibly problematic issue. It has been in the past. There were some, Greek Jehovah's Witnesses were very frequently imprisoned for proselytism. And they continued to be arrested quite frequently after the Kokkinakis case for a long time. But eventually, the Greek state started training its police officers in relation to the Kokkinakis decision. I was interviewing someone from the Ombudsman's office saying that now everyone has Kokkinakis in their drawer. So in all police stations, they described it as this. They know, they're constantly reminded that they can't cross certain boundaries with this issue. They can't be arresting people just because they're talking about their religion. So that was the first case, and it really made a tremendous difference for Jehovah's Witnesses in Greece and in the other countries under the court's auspices. Another really interesting case is a more recent one, just before that, to do with religious education, which you want me to discuss. And that has to do with Sharia law in Thrace. So Greece was the only country in Europe until recently where Sharia law was practiced solely. So Muslims had no choice but to follow Sharia law.
Oh, so there was a certain kind of autonomy in that region where they were allowed to practice Sharia law.
You say allowed. For some, that's the perspective allowed, and for others, it's something imposed on them. So, like secular people who don't. In this case, it was a woman whose husband died, and they had a civil will. He'd written up a civil will before he died, saying that he wanted his estate to go to his wife, where Sharia law determined that 2/3 of it should go to his sisters, if I remember the percentages right. But anyway, a very large percentage. Mm-hmm. And she contested this in Greek courts, and the Greek court said, well, Sharia law should apply because this is the way that, this is the agreement that we have with Turkey from the population exchange with Turkey back in the 1920s. So this is how it should work. And so she took the case to the European Court of Human Rights. And I say she took the case, actually, she did take the case, but it was also the result of really hard work conducted by a Greek lawyer, Yannis Tistakis, who for many years was trying to find someone who would go that far in the legal system. There's a lot of pressure to succumb. You're seen as an enemy of your own people if you kind of draw negative attention to them sometimes. And so it's hard you had to be quite brave to get that far with a case like that. Yeah. So that's also a very important case. And there's
with the Kokkinakis case, real fast. I mean, did they have to revise the Constitution? Because you said it was in the Constitution. That I don't really know the history of the Constitution, but you say that proselytism is actually
still formally illegal
by virtue of the Constitution. Is that still the case?
It's still the case, yeah.
Oh, no.
And yeah, it's really
I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, the reason why you didn't know it, I think probably, Telly, is that it's not such an intense problem in Greek society anymore, right? Because, like I said, Kokkinakis is in the drawer, and they're not applying that law so liberally anymore. But the European Court of Human Rights did get a lot of criticism in the Kokkinakis case for not actually striking down the Greek law. Right. So it felt like it told Greece that you're violating religious freedoms by not allowing people, but by being too strict on your application of this law. So it didn't say you need to get rid of the law. It said you're applying it too liberally. So there's gotten a lot of negative critique of that. But as I mentioned, I mean, it was kind of baby steps for the court. It was its first case where it found a violation at all of religious freedom. So it was kind of moving. It's now much more bold on issues like that.
Are there blasphemy laws in Greece?
So blasphemy laws, yes, there were from the same period from 1938, and they were only recently, I'm trying to remember what year, maybe 2016, removed from the...
Yeah, because there's so much satire against the church in Greece, as you all know, that I mean, I've never heard of a case that where blasphemy laws are actually being applied, and yet, so it must have been just ignored, and they finally just sort of excised it from the
Oh, they have been applied. They have been applied quite a bit to close down art exhibits, to close down certain performances of plays. So I'd say they've been incredibly problematic in the Greek context. And most recently, I don't know if it's most recently, but fairly recently, a really interesting case arose of a young man, I think in his early 20s, who had a Facebook page where he was kind of criticizing the cult that had developed around the elder Paisios. And he made have you heard about this? He made a Facebook page where, so it was found to be offensive by many Orthodox, kind of making fun of this. But he was arrested and went through a terrible legal battle for a long time before he was able to kind of clear his name and live freely of this.
I think blasphemy laws are really interesting because one of the things that made me, initially I would think that they had no place within a kind of a liberal democracy, but within India, there are certain blasphemy laws, and ultimately, I heard a compelling case where they're needed in order to maintain kind of non-violent, living together amongst various kinds of religious groups. And so but in Greece, it's a little bit different in the sense of that you have a majoritarian religious country, and perhaps that striking up that balance, let's say, of liberal democratic freedoms together with some sense of cultural identity and some affirmation of perhaps cultural and religious identity of the country as well. So, but now getting a little bit more specific, and let me just remind the viewers to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom to ask questions. I always forget to say something in the introduction, and that's obviously one of them. So just make sure to use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question, and I will moderate those questions. But related again, your work seems to have a certain kind of organic flow to it, and things are always changing within the Orthodox world in the sense that there's always things to continue to address and to study and to. But one of the more recent issues in Greece, which you were somewhat involved in and commenting on, and it even brought a little bit of tension between you and some more progressive thinkers and theologians in Greece, is the issue of religious education. And do you want to maybe walk us through a little bit of how that issue? I mean, what is the issue? What is the issue of religious education? I mean, how it emerged, your own involvement with it. I mean, I think it's really very interesting. So do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. So religious education is one topic that my research team had chosen across the board, across the 4 cases, to have as a common focus, as a common focal point, because they saw that religious education was a problem area in all cases, and kind of to different degrees, but in all cases kind of a focal point for problems. So we decided to use that as a common case study across the board, and through that I became especially aware of problems around this topic in the Greek context. So I have some slides, if you want, that we could show.
Sure.
Kelsey, if you want,
Kelsey in the background. Cue Kelsey.
Yeah,
let's see if Kelsey is there. Maybe she went.
Because it will be probably easier for your
just to have to frame things a little bit. Sure. So here we have the first slide, which gives us a sense of historically, maybe the past few decades, what it was like.
Right?
Go ahead.
So we've always had compulsory religious education in primary schools from the 3rd to the 12th grades. And the focus was specifically on Orthodoxy, and it taught students Orthodox doctrine, practices, traditions, etc. And I should say also that it took place within, and it's still, religious education, however it's been, is always taking place within a context. Now I'm looking to the right side of my screen where your face is now, Davie, okay, of a school where you have icons on the walls, you have morning prayer every day. The school takes you to a church service, an Orthodox church service every year where you can take communion. The school year begins every year with a blessing of holy water to all the students. I might have this somewhere else here. But anyway, so the context is also very Orthodox, besides the actual teaching of religious education. Mm-hmm. So the aim of the religious education courses until quite recently was to teach specifically the Orthodox faith. But there was a right to exemption for students who were non-Orthodox.
Right.
There are a lot of problems though around this right to exemption because it varied over time how exactly you would become exempt from this course. It changed, as I note here, 5 times between 2002 and 2015. It's always been an incredibly politicized issue. So one government to the other might change how it worked. There was always a lot of political debate around it. The common denominator has generally been a requirement to make a formal declaration of your minority faith to the school principal. And there are 2 really intense problems with this. First, that you are required to share this personal data with your school, with a state institution. You should never be asked by a state institution what your religion is or whether you are not of the majority faith. And so this, is a real clear violation of even from the 1995 EU directive on protection of private data, but certainly now the GDPR is much more strict. And so this is problematic. And the other aspect is just the discrepancy between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox in terms of their rights to exemption. Just the idea that you would offer a different right and a different approach to religious education based on whether or not you believe, without you getting a choice in the matter. Because of course there are a lot of nominally Orthodox in Greece who don't practice their faith, who don't go to church, and who might not want their children attending this course. So these are 2 real clear problems, and problems that I felt quite strongly about. So as a matter of principle, I remember I talked to you about this when we'd met in person too, that there were just, I have a real issue with this violation of your privacy by the state, and also this inequality, this unequal treatment of the students and the parents and their rights. Also, a very important problem in the broader context here is the fact that the European Court of Human Rights had taken decisions specifically about religious education, and it declared through a series of decisions that if you want to have a compulsory course, then it needs to be neutral, critical, and pluralistic. Otherwise, you can't force all the students to attend, and even those who are nominally of the majority faith. And none of that applied to the Greek context until, Kelsey, you can move to the next one now, until 2017. As you know, in 2015, we had a new Greek government, which was left-leaning, led by the Syriza party. And Syriza came into the government with kind of bold plans to make changes in church-state relations, to not tailor to every and cater to every demand of the church, but things changed quite a bit while they were in power, and we saw the leader be closer and closer in different ways to the archbishop. But in any case, so there was this idea that the Syriza party would finally bring into public schools a new system for the teaching of religious education, which had been developed slowly over years from 2011. So there's a new program which had already been piloted in some schools, but no government had yet been either brave enough or foolish enough to introduce it into schools. So they decided they would introduce this program into schools. And I should note that the content of this new program in religious education, which was designed to be exactly what I said before, critical, neutral, and pluralistic. So it was really designed with this European Court of Human Rights requirements also in mind. But it was designed mainly with the aim to help Greek students be better prepared for living in a multi-religious society. An awareness that we're not only Orthodox anymore, and we need to prepare that, particularly in this day and age, it's incredibly important that a certain level of religious literacy be developed. So of other religious beliefs as well. And the church had approved this, the content of this course. So it's not that the church itself had this terrible problem with the content of the course, but a problem arose when the new Syriza party, the new Syriza government, some people in the government suggested that there would be changes to the exemption process, and that you should be able to be exempt regardless of your faith, and you shouldn't have to declare your faith. I have a couple of points here, that the aim of this new religious education program was that it would be more neutral, more critical, and more pluralistic than it had been before. And so I ask here, why only more rather than fully neutral, critical, and pluralistic? And as you mentioned earlier, I am friends with many progressive theologians, and I also interviewed several in the context of this research. And Margarita Markovitti, who's an excellent researcher for the Greek case study, conducted many more interviews on this topic. And we found through all of this that the progressive theologians who've been working on this new program of religious studies for so long were trying to be very careful of a potential backlash, and they'd say they were taking baby steps. They took it as far as they could without completely undermining the sense that, this is still a course that reflects that Greece is an Orthodox country. And the second question here is more enough, because does the new Greek religious education program meet the standards of the European Court of Human Rights? And strictly speaking, given all of that context I told you about before, the morning prayer, etc., it doesn't. It really wasn't neutral, critical, and pluralistic enough to meet the standards that were set in the European Court of Human Rights case law. And for whom I indicate here, the Greek society, Greek church, is Greek society really ready to go by whatever the European Court of Human Rights or the EU says is required of religious education? But I think most importantly, the question here is, can religious education ever be fully neutral, critical, and pluralistic? And that's a really difficult question, which we certainly can't solve here, but I think might make for some interesting discussion, because it has so much to do with who teaches the course, and in what position someone needs to be able to be that critical, neutral, and pluralistic. So I think there's maybe one or two more slides. Yeah. So a fascinating development happened during the course of our research, and that two legal claims came up against the Greek state in relation to religious education. And one came from the conservative side of a theological, so there was one theologians union until around 2010. It broke into two, the progressive group called Keros, and Keros means time, and they named themselves this specifically with the idea that it is time to change religious education, and they worked especially on the new program. And the other one is called PETH, something like, I don't remember exactly where the title comes from, but a union of Pan-Hellenic union of theologians. So many representatives of PETH, and kind of led by a Greek bishop who's very conservative, took a case against the Greek government to the Greek High Court, so arguing that this new change in the Greek religious education is unconstitutional, because the Greek constitution actually says in Article 16.2 that an aim of the public education, first of all, that the state has to provide free education to all students, and at least for 9 years, and that an aim of this is to develop their religious, I think the exact words is religious consciousness. It doesn't say Orthodox consciousness, it says religious consciousness, but the interpretation here is that it ought to be Orthodox. It always has been, and that's how it ought to be. And surprisingly for many people, this case won. This claim won in the court, and so the Greek High Court decided that this is true. We need to maintain an Orthodox orientation. And practically simultaneously, within the same court was being approached by the parents of students who wanted exemption from the course without having to give any reasons for this, any religion-related reasons for this, at least. And that same Greek High Court, kept delaying hearing the case. They kept saying, they kept giving new dates for it, and finally they had the right, the claimants had the right to go directly to the European Court of Human Rights. And so we have the European Court of Human Rights. You can go to the next slide now, Kelsey. Both claimants were vindicated, basically. The European Court of Human Rights said, yes, this exemption procedure is contrary to to several rights actually within the that are protected by the court and by the European Convention on Human Rights, but especially private data and freedom of belief, and the Greek court settled on this decision that the course needs to go back to an Orthodox focus. And so the final development is that we will have an Orthodox only basically course, or very much focused on Orthodoxy. That's the plan. And anyone can be exempted for any reason, and there ought to be a parallel course in philosophy of ethics. Now, the theologians, the progressive theologians, are really pained by this. You know, they'd worked so hard on this course, and their main aim was to keep, not main aim, but a main aim was to keep it mandatory, because they wanted everyone to be exposed to this material. They wanted all students to develop a kind of religious literacy. And they felt that was much better than dividing students into the Orthodox and then those who won't take that course. And, you know, in theory, there will be a philosophy of ethics course, but I don't know how far they've gotten with this plan. And it always depends on enough people seeking exemption, enough students seeking exemption, so that you could justify having a teacher just for that. So how it will work really is a big question.
And how did, I mean, what was your intervention? Because you had mentioned that you kind of.
So my research, sorry, you're right. So on behalf of my my research team, we intervened in the case because the European Court of Human Rights always is open to hearing the opinion, not the opinions, a submission of facts that would be helpful for them to know based on your own experience, research, whatever. And they kind of look into those people who submit the interventions to consider whether they're in a position to be able to offer helpful information. And so we kind of explained what our background was and what kind of research we'd done, and that we had a lot of material suggesting that it was indeed very problematic for many parents, the whole exemption procedure. And so it was, as I'd said earlier, these are two issues on which I'm passionate, both the right to privacy and not having to share this kind of personal data with the state. The state has no right to ask you these things, and that the school ought not to be offering certain rights to Orthodox students and others to non-Orthodox. It shouldn't divide based on this. At the same time, I also feel incredibly strongly about development of religious literacy. I do. But that but the case was about this topic, and I intervened in the case on behalf of my researchers, my research team, to say that indeed this exemption process is very problematic. You don't intervene on behalf of one or another side in the case. You just offer the information. But obviously, our intervention was more helpful to the Papa Georgiou case, the people, the claimants. And this caused, I'd say, quite a bit of discomfort between me and some of the progressive theologians who felt like, okay, we have enough attacks from so many sides, and this is really, it was a bit strange coming from me, who they knew I am a supporter of their work and of the change in religious education. I have children going through this education process, and I was incredibly happy about this change in the books. I thought they were great. I had no problem with my kids learning this material. But the problem I had was with the lack of, I just felt it was a really unjust process of how it was carried out. So to kind of ameliorate that tension, I hosted a seminar at ELIAMEP, where I invited these progressive theologians, and I also invited on the other side the legal team of the Papa Georgiou claimants, and also some members of the Atheist Union and people who were representing kind of the activists who'd also intervened in the case on behalf of Papa Georgiou. And I think I lost 10 years of my life at the days preceding this meeting, because I was so nervous that it would just turn into an all-out war. I wasn't really sure how it would go. But it was fantastic. It was an amazing experience in the end. They really got along very well. We even had a very pleasant dinner afterwards. And it was just an engagement that allowed people to speak to one another who, people who would have really not had contact otherwise. They would have not been at a table together. So I was really pleased with that development. And I think
it's always good when that. Yeah, it's always good. It's always good when that happens, when people come together at a table and are able to speak. But these He's raised really very difficult and really interesting issues in the sense that I think in the United States, people would think by default that religious education shouldn't be offered in a mandatory way. Exemptions obviously are no brainer for some, and but it raises interesting issues about theoretical issues about exemptions, about what liberal democracy looks like in majoritarian countries, and it's not necessarily the case that it's a one size fits all. I know Cecilia Board's recent book on liberalism's religion, where she disaggregates these issues. And one of her points is that, well, exemptions shouldn't be simply because you're religious, but exemptions should be, if you're going to grant exemptions, it should be based on a principle other than simply religion, right? And it's simply, and to some extent, it sounds like that's what's happening in Greece. In other words, if you simply keep the data private, you're offering exemptions based simply on conscience to some extent, right? Am I reading that correctly in a way? And that's basically what they're saying. Like, we're not going to make religion a principle for exemptions. You're simply going to base it on conscience itself. So, and but it raises this really thorny issues in terms of, again, just what liberal democracy looks like in a majoritarian religious country.
Yeah, and it really showed some quite significant fault lines in Greek society where people stood on this issue, because you had you saw, especially within this division within the Orthodox Theologians Union, this distinction between those who feel like the school system should help maintain this really close connection between religion and national identity, and this message that to be Greek means to be Orthodox. And I think that there are factions within the church, although I don't think this is representative of the church in general, but there are factions in the church that feel also very strongly about this and think, this is our last hope. Our churches are not full, but if we can continue to pass on to young children the idea that to be Greek is to be Orthodox, and that the church, saved the Greek state and Greek identity and Greek language through the 400 years of Ottoman rule and things like that, that's going to be key to the church's future and to Orthodoxy's future in Greece. And then you have others who are not, who really want a more substantial engagement with Orthodoxy. Those who are in the faith, they've chosen it. It's not something that they kind of brainwashed into, or they didn't have the chance to be exposed to other ideas. But the main motivator for that second group, the progressive group, is that students need to learn about different religions in order to be good citizens in contemporary Greek society.
Yeah, I find it, and there are plus and minuses to both. I find it interesting when people say, though, that we want them to learn to see that that if it's mandatory, in other words, the Orthodox part, that somehow they'll know that to be Greek is to be Orthodox. Because I mean, even though things have changed in Greece tremendously over the decades, every time I go and I ask, and maybe this is anecdotal, but I ask even young people, like really young people, I said, is to be Greek to be Orthodox? And they almost always say yes, always. I mean, so it's still in that consciousness of theirs. But I think there's something going on almost akin to a kind of religious versus spiritual going on here, in the sense that they don't want to do it like in the way they see like the church doing it, right? They somehow identify, but they don't want to be involved in that sort of that's going on over there, so to speak. So listen, I want to end with you just giving us a comment, but we do have a couple questions, and Elizabeth, our friend Elizabeth Prodromou, she offers a comment that it was only in 2015 that Norway and Iceland actually abolished their blasphemy laws, and Spain still has blasphemy laws. And so I'm the one who feels a little embarrassed that I didn't know any of this. And other EU member states have blasphemy laws. These are mainly in Western European countries with Roman Catholic and Protestant majorities, and a holdover from Reformation and Court Reformation times. But she also wants you to discuss the issue of securitization of human rights decisions by the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, right? So she says, consider the ruling on Islamic headscarves of French school children, or the blasphemy conviction of an Austrian woman for her comments about Islam's Prophet Muhammad. In both cases, the latter explicitly, the court made decisions that many argue run counter to Article 18 of the UDHR, the ECCPR, etc., justifying these on security grounds. So on a related note, the mosque decision in Athens is related to security considerations. Saudi government, major exporter of religious extremism and violence, was initially going to fund the mosque's construction, and Turkey's Erdogan has explicitly stated that Ankara will use religion to mobilize Turkish populations across Europe. Can you help us make sense of the critique of the court's interpretation of security and religious freedom linkages has in many ways led to inconsistent decisions? A great question. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for the question and for the comment. About the blasphemy, yes, I meant to add that it's really interesting, actually, so I think that a difference with the Greek case that's important to mention, and it applies to blasphemy and also to proselytism, is that the way that these laws were used were only to protect majority Orthodox faith. So never was someone jailed for blasphemy against Islam or something else in the Greek context. And so what's interesting is that there's a gray area that's developed that I think we were at a point where we might have been abolishing all these laws, but then we have this worry of backlash following especially things like the cartoon crisis that developed from coming out from Copenhagen. Do you remember when cartoons of Muhammad were published and there was so much violence around this? So hate speech laws that have started to develop. And there's, you have this kind of black that blasphemy laws are bad, but hate speech laws might be okay because they're protecting us from this kind of rift in society around, religious issues. And it's true, the European Court of Human Rights has been in a really difficult place on some of these issues. That S case in Austria is a striking case where, and the court has been heavily criticized for that. Also, the case about basically burqa in the French context, SAS versus France. Those, to a large extent, those are decisions taken in the aftermath of what I described earlier, of a real legitimacy crisis that the court was facing. And it still hasn't, I'd say, found a completely stable footing on these issues. I think that many judges would take decisions in opposite directions, but they are trying to balance political concerns, and securitization is also one of these issues. Elizabeth is right. In the Greek context, the Greek government has always stuck to the idea that this is going to be a Greek-funded mosque in order to keep it a safer mosque, to keep foreign funds out of this issue. And a lot of Greeks really struggle to understand this. I mean, the state's not funding other religious minority groups in their establishment. Why a mosque? Isn't this crazy? And how big it would be, the size. There were so many debates about this, and the land that would be used for this, and how public it would be, whatever, how accessible. I'd say it's a perennial problem. It's not getting any better in the current context. We see every time we have kind of a lull, then things happen, like this beheading of the French history teacher. So
that's all I'm taking this behind nowadays.
It's an ugly reality that certainly colors how purely we can follow and strictly we can follow provision of human rights.
Right. We have a question from Vasiliki. In Finland, they have religious education in public schools. They offer general course on religions, and then they offer specific religious education for each of the students according to their faith expression, including Orthodoxy. So they have a general and specific. How does their Orthodox religious education compare to Greece's religious education curriculum? I mean, you just spoke to it, but just very quickly, in a way, Greece hasn't really thought of it that way, right? They've thought of a mandatory course that you either get exempted from or you take, right?
It's a strict overlap, except in the case of Thrace, where Muslim minorities have had access to Muslim education. And there may be some small exceptions also in islands where there have been strong Catholic populations. I don't remember whether, for example, today there's still the practice of offering Catholic religious education in these contexts. The idea is that if you had large enough minority groups asking for this, that you might be able to offer religious minority education. But this is really unlikely to develop in a lot of contexts, except the truth is certain parts of, for example, Athens have really high numbers of Muslim minority students. But I think we're very far from
other than the Northeast, but it's Athens who really has
yeah, the treatment. I mean, I think this is also a really interesting topic. The treatment of Muslims in northern Greece, in Thrace, is really specific to this historical population exchange between Greece and Turkey, and it's very close connected to Greek-Turkish relations. It has nothing to do with Greek attitudes towards Islam. It's not that the Greek government has ever wanted to be very open and welcoming to Islam and allow all these freedoms. It doesn't offer these freedoms to Muslims elsewhere. And like there's the first, well, one of the first legal mosques, legally operating mosques in Athens. So it's a striking difference.
Okay, so we'll take one more. I don't think, from Janine Economidis, I don't think there's a clear understanding of problems with Jehovah Witnesses specifically in Greece without understanding the Jehovah Witness position against military service, which is required for all Greeks. That makes the question more complex than blasphemy. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, so well, we started talking about proselytism, and you had asked about interesting cases, and there are several cases that have to do with the military service, not only in Greece. Really important Jehovah's Witness cases have to do with conscious objection from other countries as well. I'm talking about European Court of Human Rights cases. But yeah, in the Greek context, this has also gone to the European Court of Human Rights. And this kind of, the more recent case was the child of a Jehovah's Witness who said he ought to be exempt because his mother, he'd grown up in a household where the mother was a Jehovah's Witness, but it wasn't a direct claim, to his own faith. So he didn't, he wasn't granted the right to exemption. It's a problem kind of similar to, I mean, very different from, but similar to the exemption from religious education, in the sense that, this distinction of you have to prove your religious minority status to be exempt from this, and the conditions for your alternative military service are really different if you're a religious minority group than some other kind of conscious objector. So it's always been a problem point for Jehovah's Witnesses.
Why don't we just give us because we're a little bit close to the end of our time, but give us maybe just a brief sense of where are you going from here? I mean, obviously you're involved in our Orthodoxy and Human Rights project at LUZ, and hopefully we'll be together, all of us in person again, and Elizabeth is part of that, and Christina as well are part of that project. So you're all doing such wonderful and important work, and but maybe we're just maybe in a few sentences, where are you heading? Yeah.
Okay. I have to be honest and say I don't feel like I'm headed anywhere quickly lately since the lockdown in Greece. From the first lockdown, my speed in terms of our production of text is unbelievably slow. It's another world. It's another world trying to live working from home with 3 kids who are, and the youngest, his main role is to try to keep everyone else from being able to get any work done. So that's tough. But my plan is, I have a couple of books left over to complete from the Grassrootsmobilise project, a couple edited volumes that I'm working on that I have contracts for. And I wanted very much, and Christina was an amazing support for this, I wanted to work on a book, on a monograph based on Grassrootsmobilise. And I still hope to be able to do that at some point, but I was not successful with the funding application that I applied for that. And you really do need, especially when you're busy, lockdown, home, kids, etc., some kind of support to be able to take away a lot of time from work to write that kind of a text. I think is very new and needed some new research as well. I wanted to compare the research that we conducted in Grassrootsmobilise and conduct some new research on the Court of Justice of the EU, so a different court, starting to deal more with human rights, religious rights issues as well. Anyway, that and I have a very important plan to finish a book for your project, for the Orthodoxy and Human Rights project, which I'm really excited about. And it's a book. I was first invited to give a talk on religion and human rights in Greece, in Cyprus, by the University of Padua, organizing a conference there mainly. And it was a really fun project. And for that, I brought together different aspects of the problem: blasphemy, religious education. There are different dimensions that kind of come together with the central theme of religion and human rights. And so that's the topic of the book I want to finish for this project.
That is
I
great.
look forward to working.
Well, you've already been so incredibly productive. I didn't, I looked at your CV before, obviously, I mean, I've known of your work and I've read so much of it, but looked at your CV and had, pages of all these articles and things that you've done, and enriching really our knowledge of these very, very complex issues. And I think I'll end with a comment that our friend Elizabeth gives us in the chat here. There is a real divergence between European and US laws, but despite the divergences, the religious pluralization of the world is putting these issues ever increasingly into the courts. And she thanks you for pushing the literacy and such a great webinar. And I agree, it's a great conversation. We can go on and on and on. And you and I will at some point in the future when we're able to all of us get back together again. But these are complex issues. I mean, there's a real balance between recognizing a country's cultural history, and even, everybody says how in Greece, which, we share in common our ties there, everybody says how different it's been now in terms of people's involvement in church and etc. But again, people still identify. It's still part of their cultural ethos. It's still part of their sensibility, so to speak. And it comes into play when, these issues of religious freedom, religious pluralism, and there's not one way to structure a liberal democracy. But at the same time, when you're committed to a liberal democracy, there's certain things that you have to, as you're pushing in a way, when you've committed to it, there are certain things that, there are certain principles that you have to be committed to. Even though it might not look the same in Greece, US, Norway, Serbia, or whatever, there are certain principles that you have to be committed to, even though as you discern how to kind of implement those within a particular space. And you're making us aware of that. And so we're very grateful for being together. I have to, I'm always forgetting to do things, but I have to thank our anonymous donors, wonderful, supportive people to make this webinar possible. Thank all of you, and we're going to actually post this and kind of push it as we do all our webinars. To remind everyone again that Phoebe Armanios will be with us on December 15th at 12 p.m. December 15th at 12 p.m. And Phoebe is doing also some tremendous work. And the title of her webinar is Cops in Historical and Current Perspectives. And Phoebe comes to us from Middlebury College, and Phoebe is our Coptic fellow this year. Very proud of that as well. But Effie, great to be with you as always. It's always natural and fun. It's always great to learn from you. And again, thank you. Good luck with, I know you guys are now in text messaging lockdown mode in Greece. We're not quite at that point yet here in the United States. But yeah, let's hope that it ends soon and we can all, I was supposed to be in Athens twice this year and that all got canceled, but let's hope that within a few months' time, we can all be together and continue to talk about these very, very important issues. So, okay, thank you so much.
Kelly,
the best to you.
Thank the audience as well for your questions and attention. Take good care.
The best to you and your family. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.